Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I hope we have not scared the bejeebies out of you, but I'd like to thank our speakers for identifying the issues for us and setting the context. We'll move on now into the solutions and examples of how we're addressing the issues. Thank you once again to Arborists for that coffee break. Our next panel is sponsored by WSP Group, and I would like to invite Kara Sloat to join me on stage to say a few words and to introduce our moderator. Kara?
Thanks. Thanks, Larry. I'm Kara Sloat, a mechanical engineer with the Buildings Group at WSP. For those who don't know us, WSP is one of the world's leading professional service firms. Headquartered here in Canada, we have over 17,500 employees worldwide, working with governments, businesses, architects, and planners to provide integrated solutions across many disciplines. We provide services to transform the built environment and restore the natural environment. At a buildings level, WSP provides comprehensive professional and delivery services on some of the most prestigious buildings and in some of the most ambitious low-energy districts across the globe. Our projects include commercial, healthcare, education, cultural centers, sports and leisure facilities, as well as major urban regeneration schemes. Our broad range of services encompasses mechanical, electrical, and structural engineering, planning, building science, energy efficiency, food services, telecommunication solutions, as well as many other project services. WSP is honored to sponsor the session on water, food, and biodiversity in cities today. Fresh food, water, and biodiversity are intrinsically linked. Today, food production is one of the globe's leading uses of water, and some 12 plant species provide 75% of our total food supply. As climate affects the ecosystem we rely on, access to fresh water for all uses, everything from agriculture to building operations, is expected to decline worldwide. With 1/3 of the Earth's population living in water-stressed areas now, and projections saying demand will outstrip supply by 40% within 20 years in many communities. So I'm sorry, I know we're going into positive stuff, but a little more scare tactics before we get there. As the average office building we design today will probably stand till about 2086, the infrastructure and buildings we build now have to be adaptive to the new climate reality. Fortunately, today's panelists can help each of us in this room use net positive, resilient urban design to increase urban food and fresh water supplies for our city. I'd now like to hand over to Ian.
Good morning. Welcome back. My name's Ian Gray. I'm with the MMM Group. Senior landscape architect and urban designer there. My focus is on sustainable systems and strategies, working with that group. And it's my pleasure to moderate the session today. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers individually. The session is on water, food, and biodiversity in cities. At its best, a resilient city would act like a balanced organism in the natural world. Although we are far from the ideal, members of the panel have been working to reintroduce resilient natural systems and thinking into the urban realm. A truly resilient city would be robust in biodiversity and self-reliant when it comes to food and water. And I'm looking forward to exploring those issues of resilience in urban food in particular and water. Our first presenter is Sudhir Suri, Senior Architect and Partner with Louf Architects. He has a background in institutional and public projects, and he joined Louf in 2004 to concentrate his expertise on integrated and sustainable environmental design practice. Sudhir subsequently carried out the design and coordination of the green energy Benny Farm project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was an urban landscape and architectural project in Montreal which won the prestigious Wholesome Foundation Gold Award as the most sustainable project in North America in 2006. And in addition, it won the Wholesome Foundation Browns Award for the third most sustainable project in the world. Pleased to introduce you to Sudhir.
thank you very much. Wow, it's really a pleasure to be here. It's quite an intimidating group. So I can just start with this. I'll tell you right away, so I'm an architect by training, and what I'm about to talk about I have no particular credentials for. But that's pretty typical for architects, I'm pretty sure. I see it here, but I don't see it there. That's just for us. Okay. So, the talk's called Citizens of Nature. It's kind of a story told across 4 projects. So I did my best to keep this down to 20 minutes. Last time I ran through at 23, and so I'm going to beg your indulgence from the beginning. So the 4 projects, they're all on the island of Montreal. They're here. Okay, I'll introduce them one by one, and we'll fire through. The first one is the Benny Farm project. Now, I'm not going to talk that much about, what we actually won the award for. I'm going to talk about the part that we really didn't win any awards for or shouldn't have. So there's the Benny Farm. It's just to the west of the mountain, right? It's in Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, NDG. And just to kind of orient those of you who haven't kind of seen anything about this, it's World War II veterans housing that by the early 90s was kind of fallen apart and kind of empty for obvious reasons. It took, I flashed this slide because it took, 11 years for the master planning of this thing to kind of shake itself out. And we were involved, but from the community side. And by 2003, the plan was kind of fixed, and we were going to save some of those buildings, and that was really what most of our concentration was on. We embarked on our integrated design process for all the remaining buildings and for the Energy Vert Benny Farm, the Green Energy Benny Farm project. And we were imagining a kind of landscape that was, the early days of thinking about this. These are drawings from the early 90s. And the project that we actually won stuff for, and that was really fun to work on and execute, was a very kind of complex, but in some way really simple weaving of materials and energy and water infrastructures and et cetera on the site. Now, all I wanted to tell you about this project, though, is that the site plan, even though we kind of fought for the site plan and the maintaining of these buildings for 11 years, the site plan was actually made by Canada Land Company and their consultants. And there was something about it that I want to underline, and then I'm going to leave this project. And that is that this was their image. This was the vision they had for the site, okay? Frost fences and all, mandated actually in the master plan, and really fixed property lines, and the agreements were all weird. In other words, there wasn't a lot of buy-in for this idea of the commons, let's just say, except for one thing. So you see in green here, this is a really interesting thing that they did, and it has an impact on the rest of my talk, is that they established this thing called the horizontal condominium, which was actually 10% of the site. Look at the form of it. It's kind of interesting. You can do some things with that. And on the Benny Farm, with this 10%, what they decided to do was, gardens. Kind of makes sense. So they did something, but it was really difficult because we couldn't do this. And we couldn't do this because of the configuration of the horizontal condominium. More specifically, the problem is that without cooperation from the master plan, specifically where the property lines fall, I'm going to add to that the agreements around them, shared living systems water management is very difficult to achieve, we found out. So I'm going to leave that now, and we're going to talk about Rosemont, which is another project. It's kind of on the other side of the mountain in a kind of interesting neighborhood, right near a metro. And we actually had more control over the site plan this time. It was a smaller project too, and but I just wanted to show this one very quickly because, so we got to do what we do, at LIF, and we kind of tried to integrate things as well as we could. But, the site plan here, there are 2 different property owners here, and we actually managed to get the city to, of course, release this crazy parking number that they needed, which was 78, and we got 12, and then what we did with that extra space was we made this kind of commons that also gathered rainwater, which, doesn't come so much, but I'm told, we're all told this morning that we're going to have plenty of water. So, and this basin here is meant to catch those extreme events, and there are also percolation beds there to put it back into the water table and et cetera. But what I want you to see here, of course, is a very simple kind of lesson we learned, is that lots of these infrastructures have multiple uses. It's, of course, where all the kids play, and it became very important for the kind of placemaking side of the project. It's a very successful project in many ways, but the thing that's the coolest, I think, about this project is that the people say, God, I love that courtyard. I really am glad that we were part of making that courtyard, and it's an infrastructure, right? So let's just, now, I just want to leave this, for those two projects, you know, define your common spaces and master plans with food and water in mind. You must, why? Because they take up room, but they can have more than one purpose. So we kind of learned those lessons. You got to think about property lines, you got to think about servitudes, you got to think about the agreements that are being undertaken during the master planning side. And when you talk about biodiversity, you have to start also thinking about connectivity. And so here we're going to talk about this project, the Petite Rivière. Now, the Petite Rivière project, we actually started in 2007, but you know, these dates are when we were in the thick of it, all right? So that's the kind of image of these dates. Petite Rivière, what is it? It's a project far to the west, farther to the west, still kind of on the edge of, you know, it's an old suburb, but it's in the city now. And it's a golf course. It's an old golf course, kind of underused in every sense of the word, golf course. And so thinking about food and water, you know, this is just historically the old lotissement, we say in French. This is the layout of the agricultural territories in Quebec, and you can see how some of the stripes go through the golf course over there on the left. And thinking about water, it was pretty interesting. I don't know if you know this, but the founding river of Montreal, there are two. Of course, there's the St. Lawrence, but the other one is the Little St. Pierre River, and it's actually where that river kind of comes out into the St. Lawrence here, which is where the very first settlements in Montreal were built. Amerindian as well, by the way. So there's the golf course, and you can see there's the Little St. Pierre over here, and you can very easily see the tree lines that kind of run through the project. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the form of this thing. I want to get to biology, right? I want to get to the sort of natural condition of the site. I want to get to biodiversity. And of course, most of you know this is what a golf course is, right? It's a kind of grass and trees park with areas of what we call friche, of kind of shrubberies. And the interesting thing about this one is that it's not a really high level, I don't play golf really, but it's not a very high level golf course, and people lose their balls a lot, and so they mow everywhere. Right, so that, just a couple more images of, this is worth showing. This up here, this is actually what the Petit Saint-Pierre River looks like today. Okay, so it's the last daylit part of the founding river of Montreal. On the island, everything else is underground now, is about 170 meters on this site, and it's a kind of an open sewer because up here, this municipality and municipalities upstream have illegal sewer connections. We know because we saw poo in the river. So it's not just kind of these, it's very polluted, all right? So all to say, it's kind of a golf course in need of some serious remediation. So whoops, let's go back here just to point out. We decided actually that in our planning process, so yeah, we were going to take seriously food and water, which I'm not going to talk so much about, which my other panelist guests and colleagues are going to talk about. We decided here we were going to start taking on biodiversity in a more serious way, and so we really stacked our integrated design process with lots of people who know an awful lot about that, certainly more than me. I learned from them, biologists and many landscape architects and ecologists and naturalists. And anyway, it was a very interesting and very good time. We laid out our integrated design process with deadlines and et cetera. And interestingly also, we got involved with One Planet Communities. Some of you may know about this organization, kind of an organization that teams up with Bioregional. And I'm sorry, this is French, but anyway, the thing to understand is that they have these kind of 10 principles that you have to think with, and they, we all do think with these things, but they actually lay them out, and it's very interesting. And what I'm going to touch on here are these ones: food, water, habitat, and actually its connection to health and well-being and happiness. we were also, I left this slide in, not one of my cuts. We also were working with the Urban Ecology Agency of Barcelona, and we're very seriously considering how to make more compact communities that actually had natural systems sort of woven through them. So, you do what you do, right? You're laying out you kind of establish the radius around the center, and you start doing your kind of analysis and formal studies, and, where the water could be. And you do other things too, think about all of these, orientation, and we started putting together a kind of taxonomy of things we would do in order to integrate, let me go back here for a second, to integrate things like wetlands, landforms, orchards, and community gardens into the plan. One of the cut slides showed all of these different sorts of kind of interactions, but we did a really interesting thing. Referencing of regional ecological analogs. This was an idea that kind of just seems so obvious when someone says it, but I hadn't really thought about it yet. And what does that mean? It means that pay really special attention to what would have been here if you weren't, right? So we were in, of course, the mixed wood plains ecosystem, the kind of hickory sugar maple forest. And we had situations on the site which were very much like wildflower meadows, or would be, right? And very much like stream wetlands. And so, you see, if you do this, then the natural systems, the biodiversity that you get on the site is much denser. Habitat complexity goes up. The amount of living biomass on the project site and natural systems resilience goes up, okay? If the species that you use in your modeling are actually all indigenous, but not just kind of, from this area, but from this particular region. So, and then we started, of course, trying to figure out, this is just the phase 1 part. It's not like we're leaving the other side alone, but, there's a lot of that in this presentation, because we zoom in and out, and conversations with the authorities having jurisdiction always made us focus on different areas. So we started laying out where these different things could be. But the thing about connectivity, which is the point I wanted to get back to, is that you have to think big, because everything really in the natural world, everything really wants to be connected to everything else. So we were, we even looked at, it's very sensitive, looked at the Atlantic flyways. And of course, there are some that pass right over our site. And there, we started looking at also the other sanctuaries and large green spaces around us. And we were looking at local green areas and what are the linkages that need, the potentials and need to be kind of supported and improved. And we looked immediately right around the site, what are we actually connected to and what could we be connected to with very little effort. Can't go too far into any of this stuff, but connectivity becomes very important, but maybe not as important as the actual species and how they need to live. Connectivity, you have to have. But when you do your species inventories, which, by the way, you need to do if you're going to take this seriously, because you need to know what's living there now, you never know what you'll learn. So we found that we had, all of these things, 132 species of indigenous plants, trees, 35 species of birds, mammals, a couple of reptiles, an amphibian. That should tell you something right away, one amphibian. So bloodroot, on the left here, bloodroot. For those of you who don't know, that's a fiddlehead. This, also called an ostrich fern, this is a shagbark hickory, produces all kinds of food, like in an incredible quantity of nuts come off of this tree. And we found lots of, for a kind of barren golf course, there's a lot there. So, excuse me. Bats and hummingbirds and the eastern newt and the usual suspects, of course, our friend here. A little red fox. We had a breeding family of red foxes. Now, this is a really good sign, by the way, because it means that they have prey enough to sustain a family. If they have prey, it means that there's other critters around. We couldn't see, you can't see them, by the way. You just, you walk the golf course and you think, what, there's nothing here. Right, where are these creatures? So I just want to point out some, these are interesting. So, a merlin, which isn't a really unusual bird, but it's not usual to find it right where we found it. So there was a lot of excitement in the biologists. An American toad, which wasn't even on the site, as I found out later. It was just off the site, but it was the only one they could see. There's chimney swift, not yet endangered, but kind of weird to find it in this area. And this one, though, this one made everybody really excited. A brown snake. So a brown snake, a little brown garter. Okay, and apparently it basically only exists on or just near the island of Montreal. And as soon as we saw it, it's like everyone went through the roof. It's like, oh my God, we've got a brown snake. It's like, so, you know, everyone can stay. We got a brown snake. Everyone can stay. Well, it's nearly threatened. It's that funny category just before threatened. It's nearly threatened, but that's a really big deal apparently. And you kind of, you know, so everyone can stay. And where can they stay? Here's the point. Right, where can they stay? Are they staying in these kind of magnificent species, like a single, you know, no, this is a beautiful white oak, by the way, huge, just giant. My head goes right about there. Were they staying in these kind of magnificent rows of trees? No, there's nothing. There's nothing in here, practically, right? Relative, you know where they are? It's in this kind of junk space along the railway line. Okay, so that's the first thing that we all kind of learned. Right, as we were expecting there to be this kind of really rich life up in the treetops of these kind of, these long rows of trees, and there's like, no, I mean there is life, but not really. So learning number one is that understory matters, right? Is that so, you know, it's great to plant trees. It's really very important and great to plant trees, but you know, if you don't have understory with those trees, it's understory that drives nutrient cycling. And it's nutrient cycling which drives biodiversity. So, okay, trees are fantastic, but pay attention to what goes on underneath them. So here we go. We decided that wherever we found these sort of things, we were going to kind of increase the width of the plantings also, supplementary plantings, and we were going to increase the biodiversity, the kind of understory to drive this kind of cycle of nutrients. The funny thing is that plants and animals need communities of others. They have to have them or they don't grow well and they're not happy. They need these ecosystems, they need them. And even more than space, plants and animals therefore need company, and they're not so different from us, really. So we started putting together, you know, okay, what can we take out? Do we need to take anything out? How can we change? How can we save? And we started establishing protected areas, high biodiversity, medium, low biodiversity areas, you know, planning that way, taking it seriously. It was pushing the buildings around, it really was. And then, you know, and meanwhile, we're laying out the water infrastructure, and we're thinking, by the way, none of this water exists on the site, but we know now that it all will. So we figured out where the water would go, you know, 100 years from now, 50 years from now, maybe even like tomorrow by the sounds of it. You know, started laying the buildings out around all of these systems. And get that, laying the buildings out around all of this. It's very, very important because the master plan can often be a problem. So I want to come back here just to point out, so here we were going to revitalize the Petit Saint-Pierre River. And I can't get into the details, I'm sorry. But we're also going to have a kind of more, let's call it engineered wetland side that would actually more consciously treat the water coming from the development. This was just fixing what was already a problem. This is fixing what we make. Right here, this was just an image just to show some of the images because we had them, so I'll flash through. This was a community corridor that runs kind of through the center, which was going to become important for the gardening and kind of urban agricultural side. Oh, I wanted to pay, it's kind of hard to see, but maybe it's actually in a way easier to see. Notice the kind of fuzziness of everything. It was actually something we were really aiming for in the renderings, is to get this idea that, you know, this kind of, this ground is creeping, right? Oops, always pushing the wrong buttons. Is that in all of these images, there's no kind of fixed and hard edges. This has to do with connectivity. It can show up in your imagery, and it should. It kind of inspires what you do. So we, you know, we started working through this, and those were images that we were producing for the city. They're not final design, but this was phase one. So in phase one, I wanted to point out something. All of the kind of we were calling them the natural systems team, and I was leading that group. We were all coming up with the different strategies of dealing with, well, dealing with is the wrong word, encouraging biodiversity on the site. And we started this idea of corridors, and corridors became very important. Aerial corridors here, ground plane corridors. So, and this is literally so that creatures can move from A to B through your development. And then when you superimpose those things, you get with the sort of vertically connected understory, you actually get actually living, not just sort of trees, but actually living nutrient cycling corridors of life. And this is so I wanted to get here. So the bright green of phase one, well, even better, look at the lots. The lots are all floating in kind of islands of green. The idea actually that your property lines should very rarely butt up against each other, that the private properties need to have public properties in between them. The city, I was amazed, the city was on board with this. They were saying, yeah, okay, let's go. And that, in our case here, was representing 40% of the site. And what could we do with 40% of the site? So we had natural, Ian's going to get me for this, natural corridors and sort of living systems, and we had water treatment, and we had agriculture, which I haven't talked about, I know. And then there was the plan, including phase one, and phase two was going to happen on the west side. But you know what? I'm going to also talk to you a little bit about a research project about ecosystem services and human well-being that at the same time, and with this project we were working on with the University of Montreal, we were ready to go. There is a punchline. So many of you have probably seen this. It's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment kind of graphics. And we were going to look at how the ecosystem services were related to human well-being. There's this really weird thing going on here. Look at how this is, the potential for mediation by socioeconomic factors on the left here, down here, and the arrow's width over here, and they're proposing actually low, maximum, medium, and weak, maximum, medium connections between educational, recreational, and human well-being. What is that? That's wrong. We actually think there's a huge connection here, and it has to do not just with the fact that you have sort of fresher air and the fact that you're in shade physically. It has to do with your mental well-being. So how can data about habitat was one of the questions we had, kind of one of the driving questions actually, and biodiversity be connected to data about ecosystem services. And we decided, we had a whole research structure. Really, it was solid. The university was on board, right? And so in the center, there's this idea about habitat and biodiversity. And the outer ring are the kind of main subjects, human health, air quality, greenhouse gas cycling, nutrient cycling, water quality, all of it. And then the really interesting part was that we were positing that through certain indicators, things you could actually go out in the field and measure, right? We would be able to identify the functional relationships that connected this concept of habitat and biodiversity to all of these subjects. And we called this thing on the interior the resilience band. Is that somehow these relationships were knitted together across subjects, and we didn't know how, but we were sure that it was the truth, and we just needed to expose all of that. And then the weird thing, of course, happened. This happened. What the F? Is that the city pulled its support for the project, and our funding stopped. Now, I'm not going to go there because that's very controversial, and anyway, the courts are involved. But the point is that you know this, and you work for 20 years, and you still know this, but if you don't keep your eye on this ball, without the cooperation from the authorities having jurisdiction, your project doesn't exist. That's exactly what happened to Petite Rivière, try as you might. I'm going to talk now, just finish up with a project called the Biodome, and it's only a couple of minutes, but it's going to tell you, it sort of summarizes the learning a place we ended up, right? So the Biodome is, it's actually much more of an architecture project per se. It's, on the Olympic site in Montreal, and whoops. So how many know about what the Biodome is? Have you been there? Okay, so you've seen it. It's quite a remarkable thing, eh? It's like 5 little petri dishes in the velodrome. Amazing what they've done, right? So you got 5 ecosystems, again, don't kill me, Ian. 5 ecosystems in there at work, kind of living, not really on their own, as you'll see, but kind of living. You've got the Labrador coast, you've got the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you've got the Central American tropical forest, unbelievable. You've got the South Pole, essentially, and you've got our own, hickory maple forest, the Laurentian forest. And what the Biodome was looking for was a kind of save the planet call to action project, and their mandate is through education. They're part of the Espace pour la Vie in Montreal, the Space for Life, and it's part of the museums network, and through education, but also through experience. And so I just wanted to share this. Why is this after through experience? Why is this the next slide? Because I said Petri dishes, it's not true. What these things actually are, they look like nuclear reactors, right? When the public never sees this. When you step behind these little ecosystems, looking at what is required to keep them alive is really breathtaking. I mean, it's, the infrastructure we need to build to have anything close to, and okay, yeah, you could understand it for the tropical rainforest or for the Arctic, but for our own Laurentian forest, why is it that we actually have to support our own Laurentian forest with this kind of infrastructure when we put it inside a building? It's really an eye-opener, right? So we thought, really, is that what you have to do? Now, they built this in 1993. So maybe they could do it with kind of cooler and smaller systems now, but the point is the point. So we started our project, and I'm just going to flash through some of these slides because our project became trying to imagine how architecture and, in this case, mostly plants, could live together, how we already see them living together, what that might mean actually, what that might mean actually for the building, how the building could be, it's a competition project, right? So can the building be infested? To use another kind of pejorative term, can the building, that comes way too naturally, can the building kind of be infested by the Laurentian forest, the hickory maple forest? And could we then start to imagine how it would influence our understanding of the city, that it would leave the building and kind of spread out? So the thing is that we imagine this project as something that reinvents the building as a space shared between human, animal, and plant communities, right? A kind of society of hybrid life. And we can't be spectators anymore. So what's the kind of save the planet message, right? World populations, if they really did, we heard this on the news a couple of days ago, right? I nearly stopped the car. World populations of fish, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles really fell overall by 52% in the last 40 years. Really? So I think in 2014, we have no other choice. We have to see ourselves as citizens of nature. That's it.
Thanks, Sudhir. Our next speaker is Will Cowlin. He's with Aquafor Beech and leads the LID design and construction department there and aspects of their work there. He works in the Water Resource Engineering Division, and for the past 6 years, he's participated in a variety of municipal, private, and public sector projects. They focus on stormwater management using innovative approaches, such as low-impact design. You and I will have to have a conversation about that term at some point, Will. For both retrofit and new developments. At Aquafor Beech, Will has been responsible for the planning, design, and construction of more than a dozen LID installations, including Ontario's first Green Street in Mississauga. Please welcome Will.
Thank you. So thank you, Ian, for that lovely introduction. We heard a lot this morning. I'm just going to kind of bring you back to this morning, and we talked about climate change and all the effects. Glenn did a great presentation on put a dollar amount to all these catastrophes, and kind of looked at preventative measures. One of them was like loss prevention, and he kind of more specifically talked about structural measures in terms of mitigation, and even more specifically the soft measures, and that's what I'm going to get into more detail to today. So I'm going to take the baton from this morning and kind of go through a study we did for the CMHC, which looked at the technical performance monitoring of 6 LID pilot projects located across the nation. So they range from Victoria, BC to Montreal, Quebec. So just going to give you a little background this morning on why we undertook the project, some of the goals and objectives, overview the 6 sites across the country, obviously look at the monitoring results and what we did, and then leave you with some available LID resources for planning and design. So the project background. In 2009, CMHC did a gap analysis that identified information gaps regarding the effectiveness of stormwater management and low-impact development techniques due to a lack of Canadian in-the-ground examples, specifically for the purpose of looking at these types of systems in cold climates. There's a lot of U.S. examples, but they originate in North Carolina where you have very temperate conditions. They also found that LIT techniques are facing numerous challenges associated with the selection, design, and approval in construction due to various uncertainties with respect to functional examples and guidance materials. So this study aimed to fulfill some of those uncertainties. So again, project goal, this study was to result in the research, monitoring, and documentation of the 6 sites across Canada. These are all pilot projects in generally residential and mixed-use land uses. So the intent was to help build support by reducing the risk of the unknown. There's a lot of hesitation in terms of implementing LID because there's a lot of unknown factors. How do these things present? How do we get them implemented? I'm going to give you an idea today of how these things are performing with real examples. So the objective, we wanted to examine the technical performance specifically of bioretention cells and bioswales. These are typical LID techniques, probably the 2 that are more popular than, say, permeable pavers, and although they're everywhere, and perforated pipe systems. So we focused on these ones. We looked at water quality, we looked at water quantity, we also assessed the vegetation health of these systems. We also went into looking at capital and operational costs of these systems, the regulatory and approval considerations. I'm not going to get into those today. I'm just going to focus on the monitoring results, but I'll steer you in the right direction to where you can find that information. So the monitoring program, we did coordinated site inspections. Now because bioswales and bioretention areas use some sort of biomedia, sand mix or with organic compounds to physically filtrate stormwater, we wanted to look at the media because it's responsible for a lot of the water quality benefits you're going to see from these systems. So we really wanted to evaluate what the media consists of. So we did infiltration testing using the Guelph permeameter. We looked at soil inspection, so we actually physically did coring samples to look at the media, touch it, look at it, see what's in it, and then we took samples to the lab. So we did a full grain size analysis, we did percent fines, how much organics, what's the pH of the soil, what kind of cation exchange capacity are we seeing. And the cation exchange capacity just is responsible for a lot of the heavy metal removals we'll see from stormwater. The performance monitoring consisted of water quality, so we did composite grab samples where we could, and some sites we couldn't do because just the way the site conditions allowed it, similar to water quality, but you can see the variety of different, constituents that we monitored for. I'm going to focus really today on the TSS, and then we did water quality, so where we could do flow and total volume measurements, we did do that. Vegetation health, we did assess it, but again, I'm not going to get into those results today. Well, do we have an enter button or something like that? She gone. Yeah. Fixed itself. Look at that. All right, I'm good. So the media testing. This just gives you the summary of the results between, between each site. And all I want to demonstrate here is it varied. Some of these systems were predominantly sand, this biomedia, and some were a lot were clay with varying different infiltration rates, right from 21 mils to 263. So it varied. There's no real set design criteria on how you put these together as long as they work. So Trent Street in Victoria, BC, this is in a residential / institutional area. It's a bump out rain garden, so basically the new curb actually protrudes into the road surface. The existing curb line would have been somewhere in here, so they've actually stuck it out into the road. There's one on either side of the street, small drainage area. We basically could do water quality monitoring here. We couldn't do quantity. So looking at the removal rates, I'm just kind of summarizing the results. We had a biomedia that was predominantly sand with an infiltration rate of around 100 millimeters, 91.5. That's very fast. That'll move a lot of water when you're infiltrating. Looking at the contaminants, we're seeing 88.4% reduction in TSS. MOE guidelines for an enhanced facility is 80. So it gives you an idea that this is performing actually very well in terms of TSS removal. CEC values, we typically like to see a value of 10. In this case, we're at 14. We're seeing removal of efficiencies of the heavy metals anywhere from 50 to 65%. It's a moderate range. Trumpeter Street in Edmonton, Alberta, this is in a residential subdivision. It's center medium bioswales. We did water quality and quantity monitoring at this site. Here's the center medium bioswales that you see in this area. Looking compared to Trent Street, you can see that the infiltration rate is much lower, almost just over 20, with a clay content of 77. So this facility doesn't really infiltrate a lot of water. And you can see that in the removal efficiencies. You can see that the heavy metal reductions that you're seeing is anywhere from 20 to 30% range. So a lot of the flow that we're getting is not necessarily infiltrating, we're collecting it over the ground surface. So this facility is actually more functioning as an enhanced swale. We are seeing some infiltration. With a cation exchange capacity of around 30, you would expect a lot of heavy metal uptake, but in this case you're not seeing it because we're not actually getting the water into the ground. It's flowing over the ground, over the surface, and we're collecting it. That's why the effluent and influent are so similar. In terms of quantity reductions, we broke up into various events that we saw from the precipitation data we had. Outflow volume we were able to get, we had to model the inflow because a lot of these facilities, the inflow comes in sheet flow from the road surface. You're not going to be able to monitor that. So we actually just took the drainage area and precipitation events and did a little model to get an estimated value. And even with that estimate, compared to what we saw, you're seeing anywhere from 67 to 88% reductions in a facility that doesn't really infiltrate a lot of water. So that's pretty significant. Calgary Heights, this one's in Alberta. It's in a residential area, again in the municipal right-of-way. We did water quality and quantity monitoring on this facility. Again, this is kind of in the mid-range between the Edmonton site and the Victoria site. Infiltration rates are high, higher than what we would expect. You can see the range, 4 to 144. That's a pretty big spread. And at 48% fines, typically we see failures of infiltration around 25 to 30%. So this is actually really high. 18% for CEC, or 18, a value of 18. But you can see the removal efficiencies. Again, for TSS, we're pushing to the 80. We're in the low 70s. But look at the metals. Metals almost 85 to 100% reductions. The only thing we could think of that would be attributing to the higher infiltration rates is the gravel content. The distribution of how much the material in the sample, yeah, it had a lot of fines, but there's a lot of coarse gravels and a lot of coarse sands and a lot of fine gravels. Perhaps that's helping with the connective porosity, allowing some of that contaminant to the water to get through the media. The quantity results we found, volume reductions from 86 to 100%. So the water quality results I'm presenting are of the flow events that we actually were able to sample. This facility is infiltrating and basically retaining 86 to 100% of those rainfall events. Kitchener, urban roads, so this is in an urban environment. We couldn't do water quality on this site, just the way it was constructed. But we did do water quantity. In this particular site, because we're in the downtown core, a lot of salting on this site. So they put in little gates for the wintertime to close them so they're not infiltrating chlorides into their wellhead protection areas, which is a smart thing to do. So we evaluated basically when it was offline and when it was online. And all I'm showing here is we had the peak flows. We evaluated this site on peak flows, and we just normalized it for the size of events that we had. And you can see there's a magnitude difference between offline and online. A huge reduction in the amount of peak flows we're seeing from these systems. This is the Jeanne-Mance community in Montreal, Quebec. It's a series of 3 bioswales that drains basically a townhouse complex parking lot. Again, we didn't do water quality here, and I'll explain why in a second. But we did do flow monitoring, and we did do July to February 2013. There was 204 events, the max being 38.9. Included in that, and as we've seen in the morning, is Some of the flood events, there's a flood event in Montreal on January 28, 2013. We got that event and I'm monitoring, and you can capture kind of what was happening at the time in Montreal during that event. Well, there's your flow. It's zero. Zero outflow from this facility. Hence why we didn't do water quality, because there's really no point. You wouldn't want to be out there in a storm that produced flow. And here's that January 28th event. So we modeled the snow accumulation over the year and the melt events based on temperature, and you can see this is the amount of snow accumulation you had during that time, around 60 centimeters, and it was pretty well all melted. And we saw no flow from that event. So Lakeview, Mississauga, Ontario, this is a project that Aquafor Beech designed and managed the construction on. It's basically in a residential roadway. It consisted of bioswales and permeable pavement. It was previously a ditch and culvert system. That was the previous drainage system. And you can see kind of the pictures and what it looks like now. It's monitored by the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, and the data I'm going to present to you today is their data. They did precipitation, flow, and water quality. And this is the water quantity response we got. This is basically events 20 to 78 millimeters. So anything under that, we didn't see any outflow from these facilities. So up to and including the 20 mil, we're seeing zero outflow, so full retention. And that's 100% water quality as well. You can't have quality without quantity. So these are some of the bigger events. April, 7-hour, 19 mil. A day later, you got 25 millimeters. June, we had 33 in 20 hours. July 8th, that's the big storm and that we had, I think it was 2013 last year. 2 hours, 78 millimeter event. That's pushing a 1 in 100 year event, if I want to be conservative, 1 in 50. So it's a massive event. You can see, based on this, that we monitored the ditch, storm sewer, and bioswale, and you can just see the difference in peak flows normalized for the drainage area. Magnitude's different, 6.2. And you can see the difference between the outflows, the peak flows that we're getting. More interesting that I like about this example is the lag time for the peaks. For these two events, your lag times is 4 to 7 hours from the bioswales to that storm sewer. So if you have CSO issues or surcharging issues of your storm sewer, these bioswales, by the time the peak goes for these storm sewers and ditch, you're discharging to an empty storm sewer. That's basically what we're saying. Removal efficiencies for these events, I'm just going to key in on TSS. So you're at 78 to 96%. What's more impressive is that these are significant rainfall events. These are bigger than the 25 millimeter event. We're still providing water quality at an enhanced level according to MOA to 80% TSS removal. So for these major events, this system is still providing excellent water quality. So performance summary, I'm just going to summarize kind of the gist of it. For the true infiltration practices, Trumpeter is one of those ones. We didn't have a lot of infiltration, but for these ones, site designs were generally for the 25 millimeter event, an inch of rain. If we want to put that in context, that's 90% of the annual rainfall that you'll see in a year. It's typical storms of 25 millimeters or less. So in terms of water quality, for the events that we actually saw flow, we're seeing 70 to 95% reduction in TSS. In terms of water quantity, average peak flow or total volume reductions of those events is 85 to 100%. So it just gives you a context of how well these facilities are performing compared to their design criteria. And in my opinion, they're doing much better than any regulatory approval design criteria that's out there. So just along with that, and the whole point of the presentation was to provide you with some confidence moving forward in terms of how LID facilities function, how they work, and how they perform. When we get into planning, design, and all that, it's a whole other monster, but in the last year or two, we've come out with some more available resources. We've worked closely with the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. In this particular study, there will be 6 case studies coming out which detail a lot on the monitoring results that it just came out with, but it also goes through the capital costs and maintenance costs associated where we had data available, the approval considerations that were undertaken as part of these studies. There's a TRCA and CVC design guide and planning guide that are out there. And just this past year, we did a Gray to Green retrofit guides. These retrofit guides are basically a how-to manual in terms of it goes right from planning to design to construction to operation and maintenance, cost-benefit analysis, right through, and case studies along with that show you how to implement LID within various land uses, whether it be the road right-of-way, public lands, residential, commercial and industrial. It pretty well goes through everything you need to know in terms of what you have to do to implement. And that's my presentation today.
Great, thank you, Will. Janine de la Salle is the principal of Urban Food Strategies, and she brings over 10 years of experience in building healthy communities and resilient food systems with government, university, private, and nonprofit sectors. She's one of Canada's leading professionals in the emerging field of food and agricultural systems planning. As principal of Urban Food Strategies, Janine collaborates with interdisciplinary teams to develop healthy community plans, strategies, policies, and designs. In 2010, after co-authoring and publishing a book entitled Agricultural Urbanism, Janine received the President's Award for Young Planner of the Year from the Canadian Institute of Planners. She is an associate of the Centre for Sustainable Community Development at Simon Fraser University, an adjunct professor at the School for Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Janine.
Thanks, Ian. Good morning, everyone. Well, the ship is indeed taking on water and getting lower in the ocean, as it were. In the food world, that's been something that we've been talking about for a long time, but I took that nautical analogy this morning to heart. So today what I want to talk to you about a little bit, and building off of my co-presenters' discussions with you, is just the role that food systems play in city building, and specifically around the healthy built environment. So what I want to do, food is sort of a new weird, I have a very weird job, you know, I'm a food system planner. There's like 3 or 4 of us in Canada. It's an emerging thing. I've got a lot of grad students coming to me now, so you'll see more of us in the future. But what I want to do is provide a little bit of just a smattering of some framework stuff for you, and then really spend a lot of time on typology and examples. But before I begin, I'm really curious. Green building is such an interdisciplinary field. How many people in this room are architects and urban designers? Okay, that's like probably about a fifth of you. How many people are landscape architects? 1 in the back, and I think, yeah, there's 2 of you in the room. Okay, so you guys are gonna have to have lunch together maybe. How about planners? Okay, a small group of planners, and then engineers, biologists, science-based people. Okay, well, that's quite a good spread. So this presentation has something in it for all of you, and actually we all need to be sitting around the same table to be generating the opportunities that are possible here. So, you know, why care? Why care about food? One thing I want to really impress on you is this is not window dressing. This is not a box you check on your LEED ND certification. This is to me, and this is where I come from, this is my passion, but food and people is the great disconnect of our time. Jamie Oliver goes to schools in the States, and he holds vegetables up in the classroom, and the kids do not know where potatoes come from, but they know what a French fry looks like. So there's something just grossly wrong about this. One of the key things I like to talk about food, and the 2 pieces I like to bring in are health and wealth. And what we're seeing is preventable disease, diet-related illness costing the Canadian healthcare system billions and billions and billions of dollars a year. This is preventable illness. Not to mention human suffering and all the other stuff that's important about being sick, but just the preventable costs alone. Something like social isolation is now becoming one of the leading health concerns in our communities. With aging seniors, people are becoming very isolated, and this leads to all sorts, a litany of different issues. And food is one way. It's the great magnet. It's the way that we all eat. You can bring people from all different places together around food. You have a party, you have great food, people remember the food. You have a wedding of bad food, that's all they're gonna remember. So it's the great unifier, and it's an incredible city building tool, an incredible tool to bring into the healthy built environment and to some of the projects that we've been discussing today. We've been leaking economic value because we're exporting labor and raw products. That's not just with agriculture and food, that's across the board with resources. Part of the food discussion is not necessarily to relocalize food systems. I don't have an opinion here or there on that, but it is about capturing some of our regional value regionally and tapping into those local multiplier effects that are possible. There's a lot of bad design in Canada. We were a country built after the car was invented, basically, so our urban grids are, car-based, and so therefore, in many circumstances, not very human scale or walkable or accessible, kind of these graveyard-type suburban neighborhoods. So part of what food can do in the suburbs and in downtowns and in small communities has helped to reintroduce good urbanism and restorative design. I mentioned Jamie Oliver and kids not knowing where food comes from. That's not just with kids, that's just with everybody. Very few people now know how to do canning, know how to grow anything. And it's not those skills alone that are important, it's the connection to food, to farmers, to the hinterland, where all of our resources come from. From a developer standpoint, I love working on development projects and doing master plans and doing food and agricultural layers into that process. And one of the things, I've done a lot of research on is how people are purchasing homes now. And one of the big trends is lifestyle. So bringing food into your project it enables you to develop a unique selling proposition that will attract, buyers essentially. So again, it's a bit of a crass way of looking at health, but it is a meaningful way to engage in design. And one thing, we've been talking a lot about, scary things and graphs that are only going up this morning. And I think one thing I always try to keep in mind is that cities and where we live in our lives should be full of fun, joy, and beauty. And sometimes that's hard to design for, and sometimes we get lost in this, the grade of gravel, that we're using to, drain away stormwater. But what we need to also think about those higher order things, human happiness, and how we bring that into design. And maybe just because I love food, I love eating. So I've over-intellectualized that and now made a career out of it. But it's really a wonderful way to celebrate and come together. And I'm going to show you some examples of how to do that practically. Wendell Berry is one of, he's a farmer, primarily an agrarian, but he's a food philosopher. And so I've taken this quote, and this is another kind of point on why care about food. And I've taken some liberties and substituting in designers for a different word, and I think you could substitute in teachers, you could substitute in grannies, anyone, you could play with this a little bit. So I hope Mr. Berry is okay with me doing this, but I hope you would agree with the sentiment. So why should designers have a positive interest in farming and food systems? There are lots of reasons, but the plainness is that designers eat. To be interested in food, but not in food production, is clearly absurd. Urban designers, architects, planners, biologists may feel entitled to be unconcerned about food production because they are not farmers, but they can't be let off so easily, for they are farming by proxy. They can eat only if someone somewhere is farming in some fashion. So this is a meaningful connection between cities and rural. And as we continue to depopulate rural areas, this is an increasingly important linkage to be being made. Because food systems are huge, constantly changing, multi-scale, local mixed with global, and there's just, it's a very complicated world. I like to break it down into 6 key dimensions of what is a food system. And I won't bat you over the head with this, but this is a tool I use to help myself be easy on my brain. Otherwise, it would explode all the time. So the idea being that we're not just talking about growing food in cities. We're talking about processing and storage requirements. This is often identified as the key missing linkage for strong regional food economies and regional food systems, as we don't have the proper processing and storage infrastructure. You can also take that into the community level in terms of food access, and there's many vulnerable populations who don't have access to healthy diets. You also have the distribution and transportation side of things. Buying and selling, of course, there's a major range of how people do that and how you access food. The act of eating and celebrating food together. The waste that's generated from our food system. I'm going to go into that a little bit later, but it's remarkable. You may be shocked to learn that over 40% of pre-consumer produce is wasted, and then another 30% after that. So we're looking conservatively at a 50 to 60% burn on produce alone. You think about the water that goes into that. Think about the fossil fuel that goes into that. That's an incredible waste. Not to mention that every single city, Toronto's definitely not an exception, has a huge cohort of food insecure people who are going hungry, who do not have access to fresh food, who are experiencing serious health issues, and at the end of the day, aside from, again, for the human suffering side of that, is costing us a great deal of money. Oh, sorry, I should mention too, I'm couching this in the healthy built environment. Food systems is really just one pillar of the healthy built environment. There's other dimensions of that, as I'm sure all of you are aware. Neighborhood design, housing, natural environment, and transportation systems would be grouped in there. I will spare you my new urbanist rant, but I do like the transect. So I bring that into the food system planning world because it helps us to identify context. You're not necessarily going to propose a green roof in an industrial area out where there is nobody around, but you might do something totally different out there. So the idea is that you might have different treatments in a downtown core versus a suburb, and that you can actually start codifying and kind of determining context-specific strategies through using a transect. So this drawing here is loosely based on the city of Nanaimo, so it's a coastal community. They have a downtown that's close to the water, and then it kind of, grades out into kind of rural lots that are farmed. Some of it's in the agricultural land reserve, some of it's not. So we use this approach to do a charrette, or kind of a charrette type exercise, I guess. More of a workshop, I should say. And so we printed this on huge posters, and we just had people, a community forum, annotating what they think different parts of the food system should go where. So that was a tool for the city to engage community and have a plan that makes sense, because what we're not doing is putting community gardens everywhere. That's not what food system planning is at all. It misses the point completely. Not to diminish the importance and value and benefit of community gardening, but we have so far gone beyond that. That's, that's like 10 years ago. That's innovation 10 years ago. That is just, if you're not doing that now, then we gotta get on that. To be honest. So opportunity in the built environment. I mean, I'm not a designer, so I'm also not speaking from my, I have no credentials in this area, but I do work with designers quite a bit. And from what I understand, the built environment contains streets, buildings, and open spaces. So what I want to do is just kind of just put that that's the different pieces. If you're doing a site plan and you're looking at your street, your buildings, how are you bringing food into a street? Well, you might have extra wide sidewalks, so cafes can spill out, and you have an active street. Like, there's so many great streets in Toronto that have that. You might, we've talked about stormwater. You might have edible plantings. You might have food creation at grade and limit office space at ground level so that you have interest and people are drawn to an area, making critical mass of activity and awesomeness, essentially. Buildings, of course, we're here today talking about buildings. Buildings are, a standalone building in terms of integrating food systems into it. Of course, there's the intensive green roof concept, putting food on the roof. In Vancouver, we've had a really tough time with insurance companies doing that because we had our leaky condo problem, and they tried to bring this into the Olympic Village, and it was not easy. But there has been some progression there, so there are green roofs up there, and the food is now starting to kind of come, but it's not as wonderful as the initial renderings were. Open spaces is probably one of the more creative places to express food systems in the built environment. So this is integrating into parks, interstitial spaces, plazas, old parking lots, and so I'm bringing you examples from Vancouver. We have this whole urban farming movement in the city. So there's a tax break for developers to allow their land to be temporarily used as a garden or urban farm. It's a controversial policy because big developers getting kickbacks for something they maybe should be doing anyways. But it has actually opened up a land bank for people who are doing urban agriculture in the city and urban farming. So when we're thinking about, and I want to be really clear, this is not just an easy thing to do necessarily. It's easy, but it's not. It has to be nuanced and it has to be specific to your site and to your community. When you're thinking about growing food, think about where you're placing your gardens. You know, we have a garden on a community garden on 2 major arterial roads in Vancouver. Personally, I feel like that's not a great place for a garden because of the particulates, because if you want to have your kids there, they're close to the road, it's not quite safe. So siting and context are really important for where you're putting growing spaces. Accessible design, in all design, we need to be thinking of aging in place and accessibility for different mobility types, using recycled materials. I like this, we developed this backyard principle when we did the urban ag strategy for the Olympic Village, and it was the idea of food is not displacing other uses, it's being built into a multi-activity area. So you aren't hogging up, very contested space just with a single use. You're layering it effectively in so it's working with what's already there. Basic stuff, tool storage, water, solar access, sometimes it's amazing, but sometimes this is not considered, and it's kind of put into the plan, and then the site's there, and it's not serviced, it's not prepared, so no one wants to garden there, and then it's deemed a failure, and it's unfortunate, because all of that needs to happen kind of at the planning design moment. There's a lot of different expressions of growing food in the city, different ways to look at it. Of course, we've mentioned community gardens quite a bit, allotment gardens. There's also the idea of demonstration gardens. Seattle's doing an edible food forest, so which is cool because it's permanent, basically, because it's perennial plants. It's not, oh, geez. Okay, I'm going to move. Really? Okay. Uh-oh. I hope you guys aren't too hungry. Okay, and then I'll just maybe highlight urban farming there, because urban farming is a new evolution in urban agriculture. It's micro business for commercial purposes. Processing, storage, and distribution. Again, one of the key things that we need to be paying attention to. I think you guys will have these slides, so I'm actually, just because I want to get to the examples, so I might actually just, I apologize, I might have to just burn through this a little more quickly. I guess the point here is keeping in mind the technical needs of what, say, a commercial kitchen or a commissary kitchen would need. You need the right power hookups, you need the space for it, you need like loading zones and things like that. So if you're doing building design, and this is possibly something that could happen, the key is to work with people who know this and that can give you those numbers and actually maybe be part of the management and ongoing activity of that asset. Diverse food retail. I'm really excited about mobile fresh markets right now. Toronto, you have some here. We're just starting them in Vancouver. It's a great way to bring food to people's homes, especially in food deserts and places where there isn't easy walkable access to fresh food sources. And there's a million, I think this is one of the funnest things. This is where you need your extra wide sidewalks. So you can have like pocket markets spilling out. And these are all a lot of this is community-based stuff, so it's really the job of the designer, architect, planner to create the opportunity, and then people will come in and own it. Food hubs, you guys have the stop here. It's our shining example in Canada for food hubs. The Detroit Eastern Market is also really interesting. It's a food district. And so this is a place that is all about food. It's a cluster of different buildings. There's processing, there's sales. It's an incredible asset, and I think it's beautiful. I mean, I love industrial kind of public places, and this is one of those. So food waste recovery, thinking about how to work in how people can compost on site, how it might be a municipal system, it might be in a multifamily context. We haven't quite figured out composting in Vancouver on that basis yet. But considering that in design, and if the site, if the plan, if the idea is to have some way that people can, or businesses can, recover their waste. So City of Vancouver, I feel like this is a benchmark policy. We have yet to see the performance of this policy really in action, but the City of Vancouver brought in a rezoning policy for large projects. So what this is it triggers a requirement for any project that's 2 acres or more. And you have to write a plan. There's like 7 pillars, and it's, the typical things, housing, transpo, all that. And they've identified food as one of them. And this is, why showing you this is because it's not a guideline and it's not a suggestion. It's a requirement from the city. So you have to show 3 food assets in your plan. And so I've spoken with the city. I'm like, how is that going for you guys? Like, how is that working? And the response I'm getting is that developers are doing it voluntarily. Well, not voluntary, sorry, wrong. They are responding to the requirement well. The level of the proposals aren't at the level of detail where you can say, yeah, that's really window dressing and you're not making a substantive change to your plan, or otherwise. So they have quite a range of things coming in from very fluffy and non-substantive to very thoughtful and very promising. So again, we have yet to wait. I'm not going to say this is a best practice quite yet, but it is unique in the country and I think a leadership example. Okay, so agri-hoods. Again, I'm not going to go on my new urbanist rant, but Andreas Duany at one point said, agriculture's the new golf, and I was so mad. I'm like, no, it's more complicated, more nuanced than that. But the man has a point. What golf courses were like the amenity to have if you're, maybe retiring or whatever, you like golf, and that is what you want. That is amazing. Now what the shift is they're putting in farms instead of golf courses, converting golf courses back into farms, which is interesting. I feel like this is a really seductive idea. This has the great potential to build amazing neighborhoods. And this is, what I'm showing you here is an example of something I did for one of my clients in BC, and it was a golf course conversion back into a farm, which is like unheard of. It's the only project I agreed to work on that was in the ALR. So, the idea is that you take that honeycomb diagram and you basically layer it into the site, and you use, initially at a site planning stage, you use annotation and you try and get creative, you make big lists of ideas and does this work. The next stage of this project will be to form the relationships with the farmers who would actually farm the land. Part of what I like about this model is that the strata fees for living here will produce, between $75,000 and $100,000 a year to pay for the management and ongoing operation of the strata farm. That will help to bring people on site to the cafe, restaurant, to do farm tours and what have you. So what you don't see on this is the other 200 acres of the site that would be given back to the municipality and as a farm asset. This can be used for rationale for greenfield development. So if you do find yourself in this world and more curious about this, I'd be happy to talk about some of the pitfalls that this can fall into and how this can be sort of misused as a way to build on farmland, essentially, which is completely counterpoint to its original intent. But it is a fun concept, and we are seeing some examples happen. To be honest, there's not a lot out there that I feel like is a really good example yet. We still have to have one of these neighborhoods built. We've had a project in the Lower Mainland called the Southlands, and it's been highly controversial for the last 30 years. And they finally just got their approvals to go ahead and start doing their detailed design. So that is a case study to keep your eye on. It may be really good, and it may be medium good. I think it's probably going to be medium good because the municipality drove down the density, so they can't do very much interesting things anymore. Urban food magnets. This is the idea of, you have so many of these in Toronto. This can also apply to smaller communities. All of what I'm talking about has rural and small town applications, also northern community applications. But the idea of creating a place that has multi-functions, that draws people in, and is about more than just a single bottom line, a business making profit. It's about tapping into the local producers. It's about, there's a Van City, which is one of our financial institutions that provides a lot of funding to food projects, and they have a demonstration kitchen where they kind of, if you don't know how to cook with garlic scapes, they'll show you. So creating places like this is in the Hudson Building in Victoria, downtown. So what is really interesting here, it was a partnership between nonprofit and developers, and they got together and they formed terms of reference and governance, and were able to actually get a really affordable lease rate for local businesses to locate here. So this is just the last slide I wanted to leave you with, some thoughts on success factors for integrating food systems into the built environment. So consider opportunities for urban and rural communities. I feel like good design is always in big cities, and I think there's such an opportunity to bring good design and good ideas to our smaller communities and our northern communities. Create synergy between food assets and other uses and activities. Food is not a standalone piece. Try and figure out how it can support other things and how it can have multi-functions in your plan or design. Integrate food systems into the development project early on. I think this probably goes for any good design process or any good integrated design process, but to do this early on is essential, not only from a design perspective, but you need to foster the relationships that will then carry on the management and ongoing success of whatever you're doing, whether it's a garden or a kitchen or a food retail. You need someone who will be there after you are gone. So gauging that person early, or those people, those groups early on is essential and will help you to do a better job. This leading to the next point, establish management and operating systems through project planning and design phases. Uncover innovative solutions through research and collaboration. We can't really think innovatively by our own selves in our own silos and our own professions. The greatest thinking comes around a table when you're scratching things on a napkin and you're talking to the engineer and you're talking to, the engineer's like, "Okay, planner, you're crazy," and you're like, "Oh yeah, that is kind of crazy." So then you rethink it and you do stuff together. And I noticed this lagging as planners earlier, and I kind of have to agree with that actually. And then the last thing I want to mention is just cultivate the partnerships for genuine implementation. Whether this is reaching out to the health authority and forming relationships between municipalities and health, whether this is bringing on students, whether this is, there's a million iterations of what this looks like, but the partnership piece for effective implementation and not just all us having great renderings sitting on our walls and they look really good and we can pat ourselves on the back, but actually what happens for implementation is all about partnerships. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. So the organization asked me to make a presentation, and I'm not going to do it. Because if you're like me, I'm up to here with information. So what I'm going to do is try and keep your focus here off lunch for a moment or two, because there's some really interesting ideas that I'd like to hear you folks talk about. And I'm going to try and spark some debate by sort of throwing three key ideas out there as a way of my trying to start tying together water, food, biodiversity, and urban systems. And I guess the first thing that I'm going to suggest is that there's a common element in all of this, and the common element is energy. I had the insight a few years ago speaking with one of the PECs and looking through some numbers on a green roof, and that's not what I did, but I went, there's something wrong with these numbers. And in the end, what I realized was there was this thing called flux that wasn't coming into play enough, and so the energy calculations on the green roof were missing. And I went, "Stephen, water is energy." And he went, "Yep." Hadn't thought of it that way, but don't tell the states that because it'll put a whole new spin on the Great Lakes. And so, you know, from there, I think the other thing that comes out of it is we don't really have an energy crisis. We have a fuel source crisis. We have an energy conversion crisis. We have an exchange and distribution and storage crisis. And we have it at both the level of watts of energy, and we also have it at the quantum level in terms of Shannon information, because I think for me, the quantum level of energy is what starts to tie this together, the water, the food. Food is storage of energy, and water to biodiversity. And that leads to the second point that I think is touched on here, which is the idea of resilience. And I wanted to throw out a question to the audience that was sparked by a book I read by Clive Finlayson, who I believe is a prof still at U of T, but he's more well known for work he's doing on early humans in Gibraltar. And he wrote a book recently called The Humans Who Went Extinct. And in it, he suggests, he tells a story, a really fascinating story. You should read the book, it's an easy read, about doing some studies in Cyprus. And what he found was that when in the 19th century, the community in Cyprus had water shortages, the wealthy people did just fine. Because they had some resilience built into their system, and it was in the form of storage tanks underground. The poor didn't do that much worse, but when there was a water crisis that was really extreme, when the scale of things began to shift, like what we were seeing in some of these earlier slides this morning, the resilience didn't really come to the fore for the wealthy people. What came to the fore was the adaptive capacity that was built into the poor. And I'm simplifying his argument, but you know, that adaptive capacity is one of the key things we get from biodiversity at all kinds of levels. And I think it might be worthwhile talking a little bit about to what extent what Clive Finlayson calls the conservatives, who in proto-human terms died off because they tended to get too resilient. Their structures became quite rigid and eventually collapsed, as natural systems do. And the innovators, who tended to be the outliers, often the weak, the marginalized, and it wasn't because they had any kind of good planning going on. And I think there's a bit of a warning to us to not get too cocky about, hey, if we really plan this well, notwithstanding our planning has been horrendous, it seems to me, but that the reality was those who survived the perturbations of the natural system were those that had adaptive capacity. And the third thing I want to throw out that I can't help but hearing is, in a lot of these conversations, I keep hearing Ebenezer Howard. Now, maybe it's because of David Rudlin. As most of you know, he's been in the news. He won the 250,000-pound Wolfson Prize recently, an economic prize. He's a planner and an architect, and his idea in the UK is to take a giant bite out of green space and put some garden cities in there. Now, without getting into it too much, you can't help, well, he's making a direct reference to Ebenezer Howard, who of course came up with the idea of the garden cities. But why I think it's interesting is that when Howard started his thinking about them, he had two issues in mind. He had housing, urban housing, in the early 20th century was a real problem. Mostly the conditions of housing, but also availability of housing, and depopulation of the agrarian areas. So his idea for the garden cities wasn't to put them in green belts, even though that's the common notion. It wasn't really about the form of them, although most of us think of them as these nice circles. It was actually an economic strategy rooted in social thinking. And he was trying to deal with these two issues, depopulation of agrarian areas, delinkages of the source of food for the cities, and urban housing. And I kind of go, those sound like really familiar issues and seem to be at the root of what we're talking about. So scale, process, form, stocks and flows, lots of things come to mind, and I'm sorry I've taken so long to throw them all out there. Anybody want to speak from the floor? Any questions from the floor?
One thing on Howard too, he had a regional strategy too, it was an interlinked city regional strategy. And I think it was very important to take that the little city, but the larger impact.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me a bit of some of what Peter Hall's later work with the polycentric cities, and you know, so it's like, but there's, at least we're not talking about Duane again.
In a resilient city, might we see any regional, city regional, or urban aquaculture value for resilience? In a market where we can get fish anywhere, we think we can fly in New Zealand, whatever, right now. Could we ever value fish production, multi-complex systems into our urban infrastructure, but have food on, some level of food around, and also feed other systems? Given that we have, you know, the market says they can, no matter what, nothing will go wrong, we can always feed you. But might the city or region consider, I want a stock, I want a bank, here's my bank. I got something in the bank if there's a big challenge. And I can sell the fish every day, but it's competing with a lot of people.
Aquaculture is very interesting, and I mean, fisheries are collapsing left, right, and center, to be honest. So we are. I think if we were smart as a species, we would be aggressively looking at aquaculture as something we would be doing. In BC, of course, we've had a lot of controversy over fish farming in wild waters versus land-based aquaculture. So absolutely, I think, I don't know the role of a municipality necessarily in that. To me, that would be private sector driven. But municipality could help to create the opportunity in terms of eliminating any, limiting zoning or things like that. It is a kind of a unique land use, like it hasn't really been brought online big time. In Canada, there are pilot projects out there that are showing benefit. More in the US, we're looking at those examples where they're showing good integration and they're showing, you know, multiple benefits. So you're using it as a water filtration system, you're using the sludge for fertilizer, you're growing watercress in the substrate as you're filtering the water, and then you're using fish species that aren't carnivorous, so you're not using fish meal that is made from overfishing in Chile to feed our salmon so we can, you know, have our salmon dinner. So we're looking at different species like, you know, tilapia or something like that is a herbaceous fish. They have the highest protein conversion rate out there because they feed on green things. So yes, I think we need to invest in some pilots and to try and attract some businesses. There's really highly technological systems that are being developed all over the place. There's also really kind of backyard. My friend actually in Vancouver has a trout pond in the backyard, and every year we have a trout fishing day. So the rule is you have to make your own fishing rod, and you catch the trout and you grill it and eat it. But he got really attached to his fish this year, so we had to put them back.
Thanks, Janine.
I'd like to just make a comment about that. Again, knowing nothing about aquaculture, but from the perspective of someone who's just been thinking about biodiversity and let's call them natural systems, for lack of a better word at the moment, to kind of keep the energy flows, the energy fluxes, let's say, involved in that kind of endeavor to within reasonable and I don't know, call them interesting parameters. I think wedding that kind of aquaculture with local ecosystems, the local fish populations is probably going to be really important, especially if you start trying to double up uses. As soon as you start establishing multiple uses for one system, you strain the system extraordinarily. I'm speaking completely abstractly in this subject, so those who with better knowledge will be able to fill this in. But one thing that is for sure is that when you strain those systems, if they don't have a lot of well, internal resilience, let's say, if they're not part of a kind of naturally existing system somehow, then they also risk collapse, breakdown, significant maintenance. So I would say that it's a fascinating idea. Until your question, I hadn't actually heard of it. But then my very next step would be to say, wow, okay, so well, what kind of fish do we have around here anyway? Where do they live? And then what would those banks of aquaculture look like? They will probably be very different from place to place.
Thank you, panel. I think we all, we're all going to have a new perspective on lunch. We're going to break for lunch now, but before we do, I'd like to invite our lunch sponsors, Internet Energy Solutions and Surway, to come up and say a few words. But remember, gentlemen, you're standing between us and our last topic.
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, everybody. I know that lunch is waiting, especially after the discussion we just had. Internet Energy Solutions Canada and Surway are proud sponsors for the lunch and networking event that's coming up. Internet Energy Solutions Canada has been a proud partner with Sustainable Buildings Canada and sponsor for the Green Building Festival for several years now. And we'd like to congratulate them on another great performance here in the last 9 years. We see it fitting to have a festival or a celebration around the accomplishments of the people in this room and the industry as a whole. In the last 9 years, a lot of accomplishments have been made in the green building industry. Maybe not as quick as all of us want it to happen, but definitely we look forward to the discussion in the next 9 years as we move towards net zero buildings. Just quickly, what I want to do is announce with my colleagues here at the room that the work has started on the first attempt for certification in North America with the building standard high environmental quality, or HQE. My colleague here from France and Surway is here to help move forward the goal of bringing HQE to a more international audience with already success of the building standard in places like Morocco, Brazil, and across Europe for the last 20 years. So we're happy that that first project in North America is actually happening here in Toronto, and actually just down the street here on Dundas and Yonge with our partners at Ryerson University and their really impressive new building, the Student Learning Center. So this is going to be an opportunity basically to provide or demonstrate one piece of the suite of certifications that Surway can offer. It includes new building, residential, construction, existing building, larger buildings, but also in today's context, a certification around sustainable urban design and planning, which has a focus of 5 major goals that resonate with the discussions we've already heard today. The first one being responsible consumption and production. 2, contribution to human well-being. 3, the social cohesion between locations and generations. 4, biodiversity and natural habitats. 5, fighting against climate change and its risks. So I invite you, if you have time today, to learn more about HQE from my colleague Sudhir. If you have any questions about the Ryerson project specifically, I'm happy to answer those. But then again, congratulations to Sustainable Buildings Canada, the great work so far today, and enjoy lunch and the networking opportunities and discussions coming this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Livio. Lunch is being set up just outside these doors. If I could ask that sort of the front half of the room go out through the middle doors and the back half of the room go out through the back, we'll probably have a more orderly lineup for food than we had for coffee at the break. So thank you once again to our panelists, and we'll be resuming again around 1 o'clock. Thank you.